Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of the strategy pattern tutorials. In this video we're going to take a look at several ways in which the strategy pattern can be applied in Java. We're going to stick to a simple example of the strategy pattern. We'll pretend that we have some book metadata that we want to serialize in different ways into a string. So I have a new Java Gradle project here and I'll just download the dependencies for serialization. In this case, I want to download Jackson for serializing into a JSON and its plugin for serializing into a YAML file. Next, I'll create a new record to hold our book metadata. Let's say that our books have titles, publisher, and several authors maybe. In this case, I'm using records, which I think came out in Java 14, but this can also be implemented with a standard Java class using getters and setters. First, to define the strategy interface, I'm going to create a new package for this and an interface for the strategy. And we want to serialize a book into a string. So we'll have a method that returns a string and takes in a book as an argument. And I'm going to annotate this interface to make it explicit that this is a functional interface and it has only one abstract method. Because of this annotation, if we add a second abstract method, we'll get an error here, and the IDE will warn us that there are several abstract methods and the functional interface can only have one abstract method. Next, I'm going to define our two strategies. I'm going to start with the JSON strategy first. It's going to implement our interface. And in this case, we're going to return a serialized book. And let's make sure that we handle the possible checked exception. And now I'm going to create a strategy for the YAML serialization. And again, we're going to return a serialized version of the book, but this time using a YAML strategy. And we're going to handle the possible checked exception. And this concludes our strategy implementation. Now we need a strategy consumer, so I'm going to create one. There are a couple of ways we can do this. I'm going to start with the more flexible approach first. I'm going to create a new package and I'm going to call this strategy on invocation. So here we can provide the serialization strategy as part of the method invocation. That's why I said this is a more flexible approach, because every time that we want to apply a strategy, we can just provide it to this method and we can swap different strategies in and out. Our consumer is going to have some sort of header text. And now we can invoke the strategy. And we're going to add a footer delimiter. And at this point, we're ready to actually test that this works. I'm going to go to our main function. And I'm going to create a new book. And also a strategy consumer. And here we can print the result of the consumer as we provide different strategies. So we're gonna serialize our book first with the JSON strategy. And if we run this, we should see a JSON serialization of this particular book. And here it is, title of title 1, publisher 1, author 1, and author 2. And as we can see, it's enclosed with the heading that we provided inside our invocation consumer and with the footer that we provided. Okay, so now we can use the other strategy that we implemented. And as you can see, it's pretty easy to swap strategies in and out. We just provide a different strategy instance, in this case the ammo strategy. And if we execute the main method again, we can see that we get the JSON serialization printed first and then the YAML serialization. In using this approach, we can also create a custom strategy. Now I'm going to define a new method here. I'm going to make it a static method, which takes in a book. And we're going to assemble some sort of a serialization using a string builder. Okay, so we're going to append the title. The publisher. And the authors. Forgot to add new lines. Always prefer descriptive names. And now we can provide this custom strategy to our consumer, and we can see what happens. We can provide it as a function. In this case, we'll provide a function reference to my custom strategy. And when we execute the main method, we can see that we got the JSON serialization first, then the YAML serialization. And finally, we got our custom strategy. This is a custom strategy. And the title, the publisher, and the two authors. And the formatting is a bit off, but that's alright. The idea is that we can provide different strategies without changing the inner workings of our consumer. As you can see, we never touched this logic here. And in a real example, we probably wouldn't be dealing with just on string concatenations. We could have complex logic above here and some other complex logic here, and then somewhere in the middle of that complex logic we use our strategy. Alright, that concludes the strategy on invocation approach, and there's a separate approach that we can do, and that's strategy via inheritance. So I'm going to create an abstract class here. I'm going to call it book logger inheritance. It's going to have one abstract method. Let's say we want to log our book metadata somewhere, and we want to have a strategy for serializing the logged book, which is going to be our logging strategy in this case. And we're going to have a logging method that does something. In this case, we're just going to log the standard out, and like before, we're going to have a header and a footer. So we need to call our logging strategy here, and different implementations will actually be our strategies. But for the purposes of logging, we actually first need a book, so I'm going to provide a method that builds a book. Okay, so we provide the book inside our strategy. And now we can create concrete implementations of our book logger interface with different strategies. So let's do a JSON logger strategy. And we're going to extend our book logger interface. And we need to provide an implementation for the logging strategy. In this case, I'll just copy the previous implementation we had. And we also need a mapper in this case. And we can also provide a YAML logging strategy. And again, I'm just gonna copy everything over from here. The mapper. And we need to sort out the imports. Okay, and at this point, we can make sure that this works. I'm going to comment out the old logic so we don't get our standard out cluttered. And I'm also going to comment out the book because we don't need it anymore. The logger strategies provide their own books. Okay, so going back, we can create a new JSON logger strategy and a YAML logger strategy. And we can use both of these to make sure that they work. Actually, I'm going to add a footer as well, so we can more clearly see what's going on. So we're going to log a book first with the JSON strategy and then with the YAML one. And let's see what happens when we run the main method. Alright, so we got the JSON serialization first, and then we got the YAML one. I've seen this approach that uses inheritance-based strategies in the industry, but I'm not too fond of it for two reasons. The first one is that in my experience, it leads to more convoluted tests. And the second one is that in our case, we have just one abstract method that we're overriding as part of our strategy. But imagine that you have a more complex class where you need several strategies, then you can't have multiple inheritance in that case. You need some other approach. And I'm going to show you a third approach, which is kind of in the middle in terms of flexibility between the strategy on invocation and the strategy via inheritance. And that's providing strategies on class instantiation via composition. So I'm going to create a new package for that. And the new class, which I'll call book logger composition. In this case, we'll have a reference to a serialization strategy. And we're going to have this strategy injected as part of the constructor of our consumer. So I'm going to create a constructor with a single argument, which is our strategy, and then we can consume this. I'm going to add a header like before, and a footer. And now we can use the strategy provided on instantiation to serialize our book. Actually, to make it more like the inheritance example, I'm going to copy the get book method here, and I'm going to get rid of the argument in this case and provide the book to our strategy. Okay, so going back to our main method, I'm going to comment out the old code, and in this case we can have a logger using a JSON strategy. And we're going to provide a new JSON strategy. We can have a YAML one. And just like in the previous case with the strategy on invocation, we can provide a custom strategy. And we can make sure that all of these work. So we'll first log a JSON serialized book, then a YAML serialized book, and finally a custom strategy book. As you can see, this is almost as flexible as the strategy provided on invocation. We can easily pass in different serialization algorithms without having to extend an abstract class. Okay, so let's run this and see what happens. There seems to be a problem. Oh, we're not printing. If we rerun this again, we can see that we got a composition strategy on instantiation with a JSON serialization, then a YAML serialization, and finally our custom ugly formatted serialization. And we can also implement a strategy using a lambda function and not a function reference. I'm going to comment all this out and create a new logger. Here, instead of passing an object or a function reference, we can pass in a lambda function. And for now, I'm just going to copy what we had up here and change some of the wording to make sure that we're invoking a new composition strategy. I'm just going to type in lambda here, and we need to invoke it. So now if we run this, we should see the lambda strategy working. As you can see, we got our header, our footer, and the lambda strategy here. Thank you for watching and see you in the next part where we will implement the strategy pattern in Kotlin.